Tacoma, Washington. The morning of Wednesday, March 26, 1986. Puget Park sat quiet under a gray Pacific Northwest sky, the kind of ordinary overcast morning that nobody remembers until they have to. 12-year-old Michella Welch had walked there with her two younger sisters, the way they did on plenty of mornings that spring. There was nothing unusual about it. No warning in the air, no sense that this day was different from any other. Michella was the oldest, the one who looked after the little ones, the one who decided it was time for lunch. So she did what any responsible sixth grader might do. She hopped on her bike, told her sisters she'd be right back, and pedaled home to grab sandwiches for all three of them. She made it home. She made the sandwiches. She rode back to the park and left them waiting on a picnic table, like a small act of quiet care from a big sister to her little ones. And then, sometime in that short window before her sisters came back from a nearby restroom, Michella Welch disappeared. Her bike was still there. The sandwiches were still there, untouched. Michella was not. What happened to her in that gap of a few unwatched minutes would haunt a city for more than 3 decades. It would launch a search that pulled in half of Tacoma. It would end that same day in the worst way a parent can imagine. And it would sit unsolved for 32 years, filed away, half forgotten by the world, remembered every single day by one family. Until a discarded paper napkin in a restaurant did what 4 decades of detective work could not. This is the story of Michella Welch, and of the ordinary lunch break that ended her life, and of the very small, very human mistake that finally caught the man responsible. To understand what was lost that morning, you have to understand who Michella was, not as a case number, not as a headline, but as a girl. She was 12 years old, a 6th grader, the oldest of 3 sisters. Those who knew her would later describe her the way people often describe children who are gone too soon. But with Michella, there was something specific underneath the grief. Her little sister Nicole, who was only 9 that spring, would grow up and describe Michella as something more than a sibling. She called her a second mother. Think about what that means. A 12-year-old girl who had already, without anyone asking her to, stepped into the role of caretaker for her younger sisters. That was who rode her bike home that morning to make sandwiches. Not out of obligation, out of habit, out of love, out of the kind of quiet responsibility some kids just carry without being told to. Puget Park, in North Tacoma, was the kind of place families like the Welches used on ordinary spring days without a second thought. It was 1986. Children rode bikes across town by themselves. Parents let 3 girls spend a morning at the park unsupervised because nothing about that had ever gone wrong before. Nobody in Tacoma that week was thinking about predators. They were thinking about spring, about school, about ordinary Wednesdays. That collective, reasonable trust in an ordinary day is exactly what made what happened next so devastating and so easy for someone watching to exploit. Around 10 or 11 in the morning, Michella left the park on her bike to get the lunches. She made it home, made the sandwiches, and rode back. Somewhere around 12:30, her 2 younger sisters left the play area to use a restroom at a business nearby. It could not have been more than half an hour. When they came back to the park around 1 o'clock, the bike was there. The sandwiches were laid out on the picnic table, waiting. Michella was gone. At first, the 2 younger girls did what children do. They looked around. They called her name. They assumed, the way children assume, that there was a simple explanation, that their sister had wandered somewhere close by and would turn up any second. She didn't. The girls tried to call out for her, got no answer, and the quiet unease that had started as confusion began to turn into something else. They ran to get help. Word reached their parents, and within what felt like no time at all, it reached the Tacoma Police Department. What followed was fast, and it was massive. Search and rescue units moved into the park and the surrounding area almost immediately. Officers who were on the force that year would later describe it as one of those calls that changes a rookie cop permanently. The kind of afternoon that never quite leaves you. They searched the play area. They searched the tree line. And it did not take long, tragically, brutally not long, before a search and rescue team found her. Michella's body was discovered in an isolated gulch, more than a quarter-mile from the playground, on the very same day she vanished. There was no waiting, no agonizing weeks of searching, no fragile hope stretched out over a season the way it is in so many of these cases. Tacoma got its answer within hours, and the answer was the worst one possible. The medical examiner's autopsy would later determine that Michella died of blunt force trauma to the head. There was also clear evidence that she had been sexually assaulted before she was killed. I'm not going to walk you through the physical details beyond that, because Michella deserves better than to have her suffering turned into spectacle. What matters is this. Investigators understood immediately that this was not an accident, not a random act of momentary violence. They were looking for someone who had planned, however briefly, to hurt a child, and who had done exactly that in the middle of a public park, in broad daylight, in a matter of minutes. The city's response was immediate, and it was enormous. This was, and still is, remembered as one of the cases that changed how Tacoma thought about its own safety. A 12-year-old girl taken and killed steps away from a playground full of families shattered the sense that this kind of thing simply didn't happen here. Detectives worked the case hard in those first days and weeks. They canvassed the neighborhood. They looked at anyone who might have been in the park that morning. And they came up against a wall that would define this case for the next 3 decades. There were no witnesses who had seen anything conclusive, no fingerprints that led anywhere, nothing that pointed cleanly at a single suspect. What they did have, thankfully, was physical evidence collected during the original investigation and autopsy. In an era before DNA technology existed in any usable form for criminal investigations, this evidence sat in storage, tested with whatever primitive tools 1986 could offer, which was to say, almost nothing. The case went cold, not because anyone stopped caring, but because the science of the time simply could not do what needed to be done. Detectives moved on to other cases. Years passed. The file on Michella Welch sat in an evidence room, waiting for a future nobody in 1986 could have predicted. And here I need to pause for a moment, because there's something that happened in Tacoma that same year that makes this story even harder to sit with. Just 5 months after Michella was killed, another Tacoma girl, 13-year-old Jennifer Bastian, was murdered in a separate, unrelated case. 2 predators operating in the same city within the same 5-month stretch of 1986, each taking a young girl's life. It would take investigators decades to solve both cases, and when they finally did, it turned out the killers had never even known each other. 2 entirely separate men, 2 entirely separate crimes, 1 terrible year for the city of Tacoma. It's the kind of detail that, once you learn it, makes 1986 feel less like a single tragedy and more like a wound the whole city carried for a generation. By the mid-2000s, forensic science had caught up in ways nobody investigating Michella's murder in 1986 could have imagined. In May of 2006, 20 years after her death, detectives were finally able to take the biological evidence collected at her autopsy and develop a full male DNA profile of her killer. It was a genuine breakthrough, the kind of moment that gives a cold case team real hope. They ran that profile through CODIS, the FBI's national database of DNA collected from convicted offenders and arrestees. And they got nothing. No match. Whoever killed Michella Welch had never been arrested for a crime serious enough to have his DNA on file anywhere in the system. He was, in every database that mattered, a ghost. That's a gutting kind of dead end. You finally have the exact genetic fingerprint of a killer, and the one tool built specifically to identify people from DNA has nothing to compare it to. For 12 more years, that profile sat in a file, correct, complete, and useless, because the only way to use it was to already have a suspect in custody somewhere in America's criminal justice system. And this man had never been caught for anything. 12 more years passed. And then, in 2018, something changed that had nothing directly to do with Michella's case at all. A completely different investigation, on the other side of the country, made headlines everywhere. The Golden State Killer, one of the most notorious unidentified serial predators in American history, had just been arrested using a technique almost nobody outside a small circle of genetic genealogists had ever heard of. Investigators had taken crime scene DNA, uploaded it to a public genealogy database, the kind ordinary people use to build their family trees and find long-lost cousins, and used the resulting family matches to work backward to a single name. It was the first time in American law enforcement history that this method had cracked open a case that decades of traditional investigation could not. Tacoma detectives were paying attention. Detective Steve Riopel, working the Welch case, reached out to a firm called Parabon Nanolabs, one of the pioneers of this new investigative technique, and handed over the 12-year-old DNA profile developed from Michella's autopsy evidence. Parabon's genetic genealogists uploaded the profile to a public database and started building a family tree from scratch, the same way you might trace your own ancestry, except every branch they added was in service of finding a killer. They worked backward through marriage records, death certificates, publicly available genealogical documents, piecing together relatives generation by generation, narrowing an entire family tree down toward the one person whose age and location in 1986 matched what the case required. The search led them to two brothers. Both had lived in the north end of Tacoma back in 1986, the same part of the city where Michella was killed. Both were roughly the right age. Genetic genealogy had done exactly what it's designed to do. It hadn't found the killer directly, but it had narrowed an entire country of possibilities down to two names in one family. One of those names was Gary Hartman. Now, here's the part of this case that I find almost unbearable in its ordinariness. Genetic genealogy can point investigators toward a family. It cannot, by itself, put handcuffs on anyone. To do that, police still needed a direct DNA sample from Hartman himself, something they could legally and definitively compare against the profile from 1986. So Detective Riopel began quietly watching him. On June 4th of 2018, Hartman, then 66 years old, working as a nurse at Western State Hospital, went to breakfast with a coworker at a nearby restaurant. He ordered his meal. He ate. And several times over the course of that breakfast, he wiped his mouth with a brown paper napkin before crumpling it up and setting it aside. Detective Riopel was sitting about 10 feet away the entire time, watching a man he suspected of murdering a 12-year-old girl 32 years earlier eat pancakes with a friend, with absolutely no idea he was being observed. When Hartman and his coworker got up to leave, an employee cleaning the restaurant collected the discarded napkin along with the rest of the table's trash. That napkin went straight to the state crime lab. Think about the sheer smallness of that object. A folded, used paper napkin, thrown away without a second thought, the kind of thing that ends up in a trash bag in a landfill within hours in almost every restaurant in America every single day. For Gary Hartman, on June 4th, 2018, that napkin was the last piece of 32 years of anonymity. The DNA on it matched the profile from Michella's autopsy exactly. And here I want to take just a moment before we go further, because I love knowing who's watching these stories with me from all over the world. If you're here right now, drop your country and what time it is where you are down in the comments. It means a lot to see how many different corners of the world we gather from to sit with these cases and remember the people at the center of them. Just that, your country and your time. And now, Let's go back to Tacoma, because Gary Hartman's life was about to end exactly the way he had spent 3 decades assuming it never would. Hartman was arrested on June 20th, 2018. He was 66 years old, divorced, a father of 2, a nurse with what appeared, from the outside, to be a completely unremarkable life. Neighbors near his home in Lakewood were reportedly stunned. One described being in complete shock, replaying old conversations she'd had with him, trying and failing to reconcile the man she thought she knew with what police were now saying he had done. That reaction, the disbelief of the people who lived beside him for years, is almost always part of these stories. The men behind cases like this rarely look the way our imaginations expect a predator to look. They look like neighbors. They look like co-workers. Sometimes, as in this case, they look like the person taking care of patients in a hospital. Investigators say Hartman never knew Michella Welch or her family. According to police, this wasn't a case of a trusted adult who slowly wormed his way into a child's life. It was described as a crime of opportunity, a stranger who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong moment when a 12-year-old girl rode her bike back to a park alone. That randomness is, in its own way, one of the hardest parts of this case to process. There was no relationship to trace, no slow-building red flag anyone could have caught in advance. Just a park, a morning, and a man nobody had ever had reason to suspect. Hartman was charged with first-degree murder and first-degree rape. The case moved slowly through the legal system, the way cases involving decades-old evidence and complex forensic testimony often do. He ultimately requested a bench trial, meaning his case would be decided by a judge alone rather than a jury. In March of 2022, nearly 4 years after his arrest and 36 years after Michella's death, that trial finally happened. It did not take long. After hearing the evidence, Pierce County Superior Court Judge Stanley Rumbaugh needed less than 2 hours to reach a verdict. Gary Hartman was found guilty of first-degree murder and first-degree rape in the killing of Michella Welch. During the hearing, Hartman required a walker just to make it across the courtroom, a stark image next to the crime scene evidence being described. Evidence from a man in his early 30s, decades younger, and, prosecutors argued, entirely capable of overpowering a child in a matter of seconds. When it came time for sentencing, Hartman broke down. He put his head in his hands and sobbed an apology to the courtroom. "I'm so sorry," he said. "God knows I'm so sorry." "That doesn't help. I'm just sorry." Michella's mother, Barbara Leonard, had waited 36 years to say something to the man who took her daughter. She told the judge she wanted him locked up and the key thrown away, and that now, finally, he would pay the price. She was careful to note that no verdict, no sentence, however severe, would ever bring Michella back. But she said something else too, something that carries a kind of weight only someone who has lived through this exact nightmare can offer. Justice, she said, had been served. Michella's younger sister Nicole, the one who once called her big sister a second mother, offered something almost harder to hear. She said she forgave Hartman. Forgiveness, she added, is not forgetting. It is remembering without the pain. Judge Rumbaugh sentenced Hartman to the maximum allowed, more than 26 years in prison, noting plainly that Hartman, then 70 years old, would very likely die behind bars before that sentence was ever served in full. And that, in most true crime stories, is where the ending sits. The killer caught, the trial held, the sentence handed down. But there's a piece of this case that reaches beyond Gary Hartman entirely, and it has to do with what came out of a year that had already taken 2 young girls from the same city. After Jennifer Bastian's killer was also identified and prosecuted, years after Michella's case, state lawmakers in Washington passed legislation specifically inspired by these 2 unsolved murders. It's known as Jennifer and Michella's Law, signed in 2019, and it expanded how law enforcement in the state is able to collect and use DNA evidence in criminal investigations. Two 12- and 13-year-old girls, killed 5 months apart in 1986 by men who never met each other, ended up permanently reshaping how an entire state handles forensic evidence for every case that comes after them. It doesn't undo what happened. Nothing could. But it means that somewhere in Washington right now, there are cold cases inching toward daylight because of a law carrying Michella's name. There's something almost unbearably quiet about how this case finally cracked open, and I think that quietness is worth sitting with. This wasn't solved by a dramatic confession, or a lucky eyewitness stepping forward after decades of silence, or a criminal boasting about his crime to the wrong person. It was solved because a genetic genealogist built a family tree the same way anyone might trace their own ancestry for a school project or a curiosity about where their grandparents came from, and because a detective sat 10 feet away from a man eating breakfast, waiting for him to do something as ordinary as wipe his mouth. The technology that finally caught Gary Hartman didn't need a confession. It didn't need him to make a mistake at the scene of the crime. It only needed a distant relative somewhere to have once submitted a DNA sample out of simple curiosity about their own family history. That is the strange, almost eerie power of genetic genealogy. It means the past is never quite as buried as the person who caused it believes it to be. It means that 32 years of careful, quiet anonymity can end over a napkin at a Tuesday morning breakfast, because DNA does not forget, and family trees, it turns out, remember far more than we ever intended them to. Michella Welch was 12 years old. She was the oldest of 3 sisters, and to at least one of them, she was something close to a second mother. She rode her bike home on an ordinary Wednesday morning to make lunch for her sisters, because that was simply the kind of person she was. Careful, responsible, generous with her time in the small, unglamorous ways that big sisters often are. She never got to grow past 12. She never got to see whether she'd have grown into the kind of woman her little sister already believed she was becoming. For 32 years, the man responsible for that lived an ordinary life a few miles away, worked as a nurse, raised children of his own, ate breakfast in restaurants without a single person around him suspecting a thing. He is behind bars now. He will very likely die there. And somewhere in the state of Washington, a law carrying Michella's name alongside another girl's is quietly making sure that other families never have to wait 32 years for someone to say her name in a courtroom and finally mean it. Rest in peace, Michella Welch. See you in the next case.